It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when Daniel's life began to unravel. He was scrolling through his phone during a break at work, lazily browsing Instagram, looking at posts from friends and family. That's when he saw it, the post that changed everything. It wasn't anything too obvious, at first glance. Just a candid photo of a group out for dinner, smiling and clinking glasses. But something about it made his stomach drop. In the corner of the picture was Sophie, his wife of nearly a decade. She looked happy, carefree, almost glowing. But it wasn't her smile that caught his eye, it was the way the man next to her had his arm casually draped around her waist. It was subtle, but intimate enough that it sent a jolt through Daniel's chest. That man wasn't just some coworker or friend. It was David Ellis, a name Daniel hadn't thought about in years, a man who used to be a rival of his in business, someone who always resented Daniel's success. His hands felt suddenly cold as he zoomed in on the photo, analyzing every detail. The way Sophie leaned into David, the closeness between them, the secret familiarity in their body language. Daniel's mind began to race, piecing together small moments from the past few months that hadn't made sense before, her late nights at work, the sudden meetings that weren't on the calendar, the vague excuses about spending time with old friends. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he refreshed the page, scanning through Sophie's tagged posts and recent activity. There were more photos, each one more damning than the last. Dinners, outings, even a weekend getaway that Sophie had said was for a work retreat. David was in all of them, lurking in the background, his presence now unmistakable. At first, Daniel tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was all innocent. Maybe she hadn't told him about David because it wasn't important. But the more he stared at the photos, the more that nagging voice in his head grew louder. There was no way this was a coincidence. She was hiding something. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest, like the air had been sucked out of the room. His phone buzzed in his hand, an incoming text from Sophie. "Hey babe, I'll be home late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you." His blood ran cold. The cheerful, loving tone of the message felt like a slap in the face. It was as if she was taunting him, daring him to dig deeper. Daniel clenched his jaw, the anger rising inside him like a slow burn. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he wasn't naive either. He had to know for sure. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that photo, Sophie and David, side by side, smiling like there was nothing wrong. His mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? What else had she lied about? The more he thought about it, the more his suspicions grew. In the days that followed, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his life was slowly unraveling. He started paying closer attention to Sophie's schedule, noting the times she said she'd be at work or with friends. He tried to catch her in small lies, asking casual questions about her day, looking for any inconsistency. And each time, her answers seemed just a little too rehearsed, a little too perfect. The distance between them had been growing for months, but now it was like a chasm had opened up. Daniel couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Every kiss, every "I love you" felt hollow, like a performance. But he wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. He needed more than a few suspicious photos. He needed proof. So, he began quietly investigating, starting with her phone. Late at night, while she was in the shower or asleep, he'd scroll through her messages and social media, looking for anything that could confirm his worst fears. But Sophie was careful, smarter than he'd given her credit for. There were no incriminating texts, no obvious red flags. But the absence of evidence only made Daniel more certain that she was hiding something. It wasn't just about the photos anymore. It was about the lies. The secret life Sophie had built right under his nose, one she hadn't even bothered to conceal completely. And that was the most painful part, it wasn't that she was cheating. It was that she thought he wouldn't notice. She believed he wasn't smart enough to figure it out. But she was wrong. The days following Daniel's discovery felt like living in a surreal nightmare. Sophie carried on as if nothing had changed, but to Daniel, every moment felt charged with tension. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. That Instagram photo had been the spark, but now, every little detail seemed to confirm his suspicions. Daniel became hyper-aware of Sophie's behavior. He studied her closely, the way she smiled, how she kissed him goodbye in the mornings, the tone of her voice when she said she loved him. It all felt wrong, like she was performing a role rather than being the woman he had once known. There was a distance in her eyes, a detachment that he hadn't noticed before. Or maybe he had noticed, but had been too blind to see it for what it was. He started paying closer attention to her routine. Sophie had always been independent, often working late or going out with friends. But now, those late nights took on a darker meaning. The work meetings suddenly seemed too frequent, too perfectly timed. Whenever he asked about her day, her responses were brief and evasive, like she didn't want to offer too much information. Daniel couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed concrete proof, something undeniable. And so, his hidden investigation began. Late at night, when Sophie was asleep or in the shower, Daniel would quietly slip her phone from the nightstand. He'd learned the passcode long ago, a small detail she hadn't bothered to change. At first, he only found mundane texts, conversations with friends, work-related messages, family group chats. There was nothing incriminating, nothing that suggested she was hiding an affair. But that only made him more suspicious. Sophie wasn't stupid. If she was seeing someone else, she wouldn't leave a trail so easily found. Daniel expanded his search. He began checking her emails, scrolling through her social media accounts, looking for any signs of secret communication. But Sophie had covered her tracks well. No damning messages, no obvious clues. It was frustrating. The more careful she was, the more Daniel knew there had to be something deeper going on. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe she was using a different app, one she had hidden from him. Or maybe she was only seeing David in person, keeping their interactions off the digital radar. Every theory fed into the growing storm of paranoia building inside him. But he knew he couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He needed to stay calm, to play the long game. If he tipped his hand too early, Sophie would just become more careful. And if she realized he was watching her, she'd have all the time in the world to cover up the affair. One evening, Daniel decided to check their location-sharing app. It was something they had set up years ago for safety reasons, mostly when they traveled. He hadn't used it in a long time, but he knew Sophie still had it on her phone. With a few taps, he saw her current location. She had told him she was working late, finishing up a project with her team. But the app showed her in a completely different part of town, nowhere near her office. His heart pounded in his chest as he zoomed in on the map. She was at some nondescript address in a quiet residential neighborhood. It wasn't a restaurant, not a bar, not anything that made sense for work. Just a house. A house that had no connection to anything he could think of. Daniel stared at the screen, his mind racing. This was it, he was finally onto something. He fought the urge to drive there right away, to catch her in the act. But he knew better. If he showed up now, without more information, it would be a confrontation with no resolution. Sophie would deny everything, and he'd be left looking like a paranoid fool. He needed to be smarter than that. Instead, Daniel began tracking her patterns more carefully. He noted every time she claimed to be working late or going out with friends. Every time she said she was at work but ended up somewhere else. He kept meticulous records, dates, times, locations. It was exhausting, living a double life of his own. But he knew it was necessary. He couldn't rely on gut feelings or assumptions. He needed irrefutable evidence. Then, one evening, Daniel made a decision that would push him closer to the truth. He called Thomas, his old friend and private investigator. Thomas had helped him with a few things in the past, small favors that never amounted to much. But this was different. Daniel explained the situation, how he suspected Sophie was having an affair but didn't have the proof yet. Thomas listened carefully, asking questions here and there, his voice calm and professional. "You're doing the right thing," Thomas said. "You can't go into this without solid evidence. Let me follow her for a week, and we'll see what turns up." Daniel agreed. It was time to let someone else take over. He had done everything he could on his own, but now he needed a professional. He needed someone who could see what he couldn't. As the days passed, Daniel found himself both anxious and relieved. Anxious for the truth, but relieved that the burden of constantly watching her was no longer his alone. Thomas would find what he needed, he was sure of it. By the end of the week, the truth would come to light. And Daniel would be ready. The week after Daniel hired Thomas felt like the longest week of his life. Every day, he waited for the phone to ring, half expecting the worst but hoping, against all reason, that it would be nothing. He tried to carry on with his usual routine, work, gym, dinner with friends, but his mind was consumed by thoughts of Sophie. What would he do if his suspicions were confirmed? Could he really confront her, face to face, with the truth? Or would he crumble, unable to handle the betrayal? Each night, when Sophie came home late, Daniel played the role of the unsuspecting husband. He smiled, asked about her day, pretended not to notice how she avoided eye contact or how she gave him vague answers about her meetings. But inside, he was on edge, waiting for the moment everything would come crashing down. It was on a Friday evening when Thomas finally called. Daniel had been expecting it, yet the sound of his phone buzzing still made his heart race. He took a deep breath before answering, his hands clammy as he held the phone to his ear. "Daniel," Thomas's voice was calm, but there was a seriousness to it that told Daniel everything he needed to know. "We need to meet. You're going to want to see this." Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. "All right," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where?" "Let's meet at the park near your place. I'll be there in 30. Daniel hung up and stared at the phone for a moment, the weight of what was coming settling over him like a heavy blanket. This was it. He was about to get the truth, whether he was ready for it or not. The drive to the park felt like a blur, his mind racing through every possible scenario. Maybe it wasn't as bad as he thought. Maybe Thomas had found nothing, and this was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, Daniel knew better. Thomas was already sitting on a bench when Daniel arrived, a manila folder in his lap. He looked up as Daniel approached, and there was no need for words. The look in Thomas's eyes said it all. "Let's take a walk," Thomas said, standing up and gesturing toward the path that wound through the park. Daniel followed him in silence, the tension between them thick. After a few moments, Thomas handed him the folder. "Everything you need to know is in there," Thomas said quietly. "I'm sorry, Daniel." Daniel opened the folder with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. The first thing he saw were photos, dozens of them, each one more damning than the last. Sophie and David, together at a hotel. Her smiling as she leaned into him, their bodies close, too close. In another photo, they were holding hands as they walked into a restaurant, looking like a couple who had been together for years. Then, a shot of them sitting at a bar, Sophie laughing at something David had said, her hand resting on his knee. Daniel's vision blurred as he flipped through the photos, each one a knife twisting deeper into his chest. There was no denying it now. Sophie wasn't just seeing David casually, this was a full-blown affair. She hadn't just betrayed him physically, she'd been emotionally involved with another man for who knows how long. "How long has this been going on?" Daniel asked, his voice thick with emotion as he forced himself to look at the evidence. "At least a few months," Thomas replied, his tone sympathetic but professional. "They've been meeting regularly, hotels, restaurants, even a weekend getaway at a cabin about 2 hours from here." "She told you she was on a work retreat." Daniel felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The work retreat. He remembered that weekend. She'd kissed him goodbye, told him not to worry, said she'd be back by Sunday evening. He'd believed her. He'd trusted her. And the whole time, she was with him. "There's more," Thomas said, his voice hesitant. I dug a little deeper into David Ellis. "It's not just an affair, Daniel. David, well, he's not in a good place financially. His business is on the verge of collapse, and he's in a lot of debt. It's possible he's been using Sophie, not just emotionally but financially." Daniel clenched his jaw, rage bubbling up inside him. "You're telling me she's helping him? Giving him money?" "It's hard to say for sure," Thomas replied. "But I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. She's invested in him in more ways than one. This is bigger than just infidelity, Daniel. This guy's trouble." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It was one thing to find out about the affair, but the idea that Sophie might be financially supporting David made his blood boil. How could she be so reckless, so blind? And why David, of all people? The man was a snake, someone who had always held a grudge against Daniel after losing out on several business deals. Now, it seemed he'd found a new way to strike at him, through Sophie. Daniel closed the folder and looked at Thomas, his mind swirling with anger and betrayal. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice hollow. Thomas paused, then put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Take your time, Daniel. Process this. Don't rush into anything. You've got the proof now. When you're ready, confront her. But make sure you're in control. Don't let her dictate the terms." Daniel nodded, but the truth was, he didn't know how to move forward. His world had just crumbled around him, and the woman he had trusted more than anyone had shattered that trust beyond repair. As they continued walking, Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. Confronting Sophie, leaving her, exposing her affair to everyone they knew. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to be the victim in this. Sophie and David had made a mistake, and Daniel was determined to make them pay for it. The photos, the lies, the betrayal, it all burned inside him like a fire he couldn't extinguish. But now, that fire would fuel him. He wasn't going to let this destroy him. He was going to turn the tables. And when the time was right, Sophie wouldn't know what hit her. Daniel spent the rest of the weekend locked in a fog of disbelief. The photos Thomas had shown him, the knowledge of Sophie's affair with David, all of it felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He stared at the images over and over, the same gut-wrenching realization hitting him every time. Sophie wasn't just unfaithful, she was deeply involved with someone else, and for months, she'd been playing him like a fool. The house was eerily quiet as Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the manila folder of evidence still lying in front of him. Sophie had gone out for the evening, claiming to be at a friend's birthday dinner. He could barely bring himself to look at her as she left, the familiar guilt in her eyes masked by her cheerful goodbye. It was worse now, knowing the truth. Every word she said felt hollow, every gesture insincere. The simple things, her kiss on his cheek, her casual, "I'll be home late," now felt like tiny betrayals in their own right. But the worst part was the rage simmering just beneath the surface, always present but never fully boiling over. It took everything in him not to explode, not to confront her right there and scream at her for the lies, the deceit, the affair with David. But he knew he couldn't, not yet. Not until he had a plan. Daniel's mind whirled with possibilities, but each one only added to his emotional turmoil. Could he forgive her? Could he look past everything and try to salvage their marriage? Or had too much damage already been done? Every time he considered confronting her, the idea of forgiveness seemed laughable. The evidence was there, staring him in the face. Sophie had chosen someone else, built a life behind his back, and continued to lie to his face every single day. How could he ever trust her again? He thought about leaving her, about packing his bags and walking out of the house they had built together. But the idea felt hollow, like an empty gesture. Running away wasn't the answer, and it certainly wouldn't fix the damage she had done. And then there was David. The thought of him, the man who had wormed his way into Sophie's life, and his, made Daniel's blood boil. This wasn't just an affair, this was David getting the upper hand in a way Daniel had never expected. David had always resented Daniel, ever since the real estate deal years ago that Daniel had won. Daniel had brushed off David's bitterness at the time, never thinking it would turn into something personal. But now it was clear, David had used Sophie as a weapon, a way to get back at him. And Sophie had fallen right into the trap. Daniel poured himself a drink, trying to steady his nerves. His mind cycled through the same questions: why? How long had it been going on? What had he done to push her away? But no matter how hard he searched for answers, the truth was the same: Sophie had made her choice, and now he had to make his. The anger swirled inside him, but Daniel refused to let it control him. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, to think things through before acting. This situation would be no different. He wouldn't confront Sophie just yet. He needed more time, more information. He needed a plan. Over the next few days, Daniel withdrew into himself. He spoke less, listened more, observing every move Sophie made. Her lies were becoming easier to spot now, her casual deflections, the way she avoided talking about certain parts of her day. Daniel watched her like a detective studying a suspect, cataloging every small inconsistency, every clue that pointed to her affair. It was almost surreal, living with someone he no longer trusted, someone who had become a stranger in his own home. Sophie, for her part, seemed oblivious to the fact that Daniel knew everything. She continued her routine as usual, texting him during the day, making dinner plans, pretending that their marriage was still intact. But every night, when she went out or stayed late at work, Daniel knew exactly where she was, where she really was. The worst part was the waiting. Every time Sophie walked through the door, Daniel felt the weight of his own silence pressing down on him. He wanted to confront her, to throw the evidence in her face and demand an explanation. But he couldn't. Not yet. He was still building his case, still preparing for the moment when he would finally confront her and take back control of his life. He wanted to be ready, mentally, emotionally, and legally. And so, he waited. On the surface, everything appeared normal. They still went out to dinner, still attended events together, still exchanged pleasantries like any other couple. But beneath the surface, Daniel was unraveling. He barely slept, tossing and turning every night, consumed by thoughts of Sophie and David. What were they doing right now? What lies was she telling him? Daniel knew he couldn't live like this forever. The emotional toll was becoming too great. His once clear focus was clouded by anger and pain, and it was only a matter of time before something snapped. But he couldn't let that happen. Not yet. He needed to confront her. He needed to expose her lies. But most of all, he needed to take control of the situation, to turn the tables, to make sure that when it all came crashing down, Sophie would be the one left picking up the pieces. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel's resolve hardened. He was no longer just the victim of her betrayal. He was a man with a plan. A man who would not be made a fool of. And when the time came, he would make sure Sophie felt every ounce of the pain she had caused him. The emotional fallout from Sophie's betrayal had changed him. Daniel wasn't the same person anymore. He wasn't the trusting, loving husband he had been before. He was something else now, something colder, something stronger. And he was ready for what came next. As the weeks passed, the raw pain of betrayal slowly began to morph into something colder, sharper: revenge. Daniel had always been a man of reason, someone who could think his way out of any situation. But this time, it wasn't just about getting out. It was about winning, about making sure Sophie and David paid for what they had done. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that confronting her without a plan would leave him vulnerable. Sophie was cunning, and if he rushed into it, she might turn the tables on him, play the victim, twist the story, or worse, walk away with half of everything he had worked for. Daniel couldn't let that happen. He needed to strike when the time was right, and when he did, it had to be devastating. His first step was securing his assets. Over the course of several days, Daniel quietly visited his lawyer, under the guise of reviewing their estate plan. He moved money into separate accounts, changed the passwords on their shared online banking, and took steps to protect his investments. If Sophie thought she was going to walk away from this with any of his hard-earned money, she was sorely mistaken. Daniel wasn't just preparing for the emotional fallout, he was protecting himself financially. He made sure to cover his tracks, of course. The last thing he needed was for Sophie to catch wind of what he was doing. She still believed she had him fooled, and for now, that was exactly how he wanted it. Every night, she'd come home, smile, kiss him on the cheek, and pretend their marriage was still intact. But Daniel could see the cracks in her facade. He knew she was lying, that she was counting down the days until she could be with David full-time. Little did she know, Daniel was counting down, too, just for very different reasons. As Daniel methodically secured his finances, he began gathering more evidence. The photos Thomas had given him were enough to confirm the affair, but Daniel wanted more, he needed everything. Phone records, emails, financial transfers, anything that would paint a clear picture of just how deep Sophie's involvement with David went. He hired Thomas for another week, this time with a focus on tracking their spending. Daniel had a hunch that Sophie was siphoning money to David, helping him stay afloat while his business collapsed. If Daniel could prove that, it would be the nail in the coffin. Thomas's findings only fueled Daniel's fury. It turned out that Sophie had been helping David financially, transferring small amounts here and there to avoid suspicion. But over time, those transfers added up, draining their shared savings account. David's financial situation was worse than Daniel had imagined, debts, unpaid loans, and lawsuits were piling up, and he was using Sophie as his personal ATM to stay afloat. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore, it was financial. Sophie had been actively helping a man who was essentially his enemy, funneling money from their marriage to support someone who had spent years trying to tear Daniel down. It was the ultimate insult. But Daniel didn't let the anger consume him. No, he was smarter than that. He channeled it, focused it, and began crafting a plan that would leave both Sophie and David with nothing. He wasn't just going to expose the affair. He was going to destroy the fantasy world they had built, brick by brick. The more he thought about it, the more meticulous his plan became. First, he would confront Sophie, but not until everything was in place. He would gather all the evidence, lay it out in front of her, and watch as her world crumbled. But the confrontation would only be the beginning. Daniel wanted to ensure that Sophie walked away with nothing, that her future with David was as bleak as the mess they had created. He began planting seeds of doubt in her mind, subtle comments about their finances, casual mentions of selling the house or restructuring their investments. Sophie, ever calculating, latched onto these comments, probably thinking she'd be able to walk away with a sizable share of their assets. But Daniel was already several steps ahead, making sure that when the time came, Sophie would realize too late that she had lost everything. On the surface, everything between them seemed normal. They still had dinners together, still went out on weekends, still talked about plans for the future. But beneath the surface, Daniel was methodically preparing for the moment when it would all come crashing down. He even began preparing for what he'd say when the time finally came to confront her. He rehearsed it in his mind, running through every possible scenario. Would she cry? Would she deny it? Or would she try to turn it around, make him out to be the bad guy? Daniel didn't care. Whatever her reaction, he would be ready. He imagined the moment over and over, the look on her face when she realized that he knew everything, that she had been outplayed. Daniel pictured her standing there, stunned and speechless, as he calmly laid out every detail of her betrayal. The hotel visits, the money transfers, the lies. He wanted to see the panic in her eyes when she realized there was no way out, no lie she could tell that would undo the damage. But Daniel's plan didn't end with the confrontation. No, that was just the beginning. Once Sophie was exposed, he would turn his attention to David. Daniel had always considered David a minor annoyance, a business rival who had tried and failed to beat him in the past. But now, David had made it personal. And Daniel had every intention of making him pay for it. He knew David's business was failing, that he was on the verge of losing everything. Daniel had already started reaching out to a few contacts, people who might be interested in acquiring David's assets, at a fraction of their worth, of course. Daniel wasn't just going to take Sophie away from him. He was going to take everything. As the pieces of the plan fell into place, Daniel felt a sense of control returning to his life. He wasn't the helpless victim anymore. He was the one calling the shots, the one who would decide how this all ended. Sophie and David had underestimated him, and soon, they would realize just how wrong they had been. Daniel kept up the charade for a few more weeks, carefully biding his time. Every night, he would smile at Sophie, kiss her goodnight, and pretend that everything was fine. But inside, he was counting down the days, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. And when that moment finally came, it would be devastating. Daniel had become an expert at pretending. Every morning, he woke up next to Sophie, smiled as though nothing was wrong, and went through the motions of their daily routine. To anyone watching from the outside, they were just another married couple, comfortable, content, happy even. But inside, Daniel's mind was a battlefield, one where every word and every action was carefully calculated as part of a larger game. The hardest part wasn't controlling his anger or his urge to confront her, it was acting like he didn't know. Sophie was still carrying on as if she were the perfect wife, sending him affectionate texts, planning weekend outings, and making dinner plans. But Daniel knew exactly where she was during her late nights at work or drinks with friends. She was with David, the man who had slithered into their marriage and turned his world upside down. Daniel wasn't sure if she noticed the slight changes in him. He had become quieter, more observant, but he still made sure to act interested when she talked about her day. He nodded at all the right moments, smiled when he needed to, but inside, every conversation felt like another betrayal. Every word she said was a reminder of the web of lies she had spun. He couldn't let her know he had discovered everything. Not yet. He had to keep up the illusion until his plan was fully in place. Sophie was still convinced that she was in control, that she could walk away from their marriage when the time was right, taking with her a large chunk of his wealth. She didn't realize that Daniel had already taken steps to ensure that wouldn't happen. He had locked down their joint accounts, secured his assets, and rerouted financial transactions to make sure she couldn't touch anything. But Sophie remained blissfully unaware, thinking she was getting away with everything. It was almost amusing, watching her go through the motions of their life together, pretending to care about their future, while all the while planning her escape. Daniel would catch her sometimes, texting someone under the table during dinner, her face lighting up with a smile when she thought he wasn't looking. He knew who it was. David. The same man she was siphoning money to, helping him stay afloat while his failing business crashed around him. The evenings were the hardest. Sophie would sit next to him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched TV. She would snuggle into him, occasionally planting a kiss on his cheek, as if nothing was wrong. And every time, Daniel felt the weight of her lies pressing down on him, the knowledge that she was only doing this to keep up appearances. How many times had she done the same thing with David? How many times had she left their house to be with him, only to return later and act like nothing had happened? Daniel had to remind himself that this was all part of the plan. He couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He had to stay in control, to play the long game. His confrontation with Sophie would come, but not until he was ready. Not until he had everything in place to make sure she didn't just lose the affair, she lost everything. As the weeks went on, Daniel became even more meticulous about covering his tracks. He made sure Sophie never had any reason to suspect he was planning something. He still cooked dinner for her, still planned their weekends, still attended social events together as though they were the perfect couple. He even started talking about their future again, about vacations they could take or investments they could make. Sophie played along, nodding and smiling, probably thinking about how she could use their future plans to her advantage when she eventually left. But every time they talked about money, about their future, Daniel felt a strange satisfaction. She had no idea that her future had already been rewritten. That she wouldn't be walking away from their marriage with a dime. Daniel's patience was tested the most during their social outings. They still went to dinner with friends, still visited family, and still hosted gatherings at their home. Each event felt like an act, with Sophie playing the loving wife while Daniel played the unsuspecting husband. He couldn't help but wonder what their friends would think if they knew the truth, if they knew that behind the smiles and the small talk, Sophie was planning to leave him for another man. But he didn't let those thoughts consume him. Not yet. He would have his moment soon enough. And when it came, it would be on his terms. One evening, they attended a dinner party at a close friend's house. As usual, Sophie was the picture of perfection, smiling, laughing, engaging with their friends as though nothing was wrong. Daniel watched her from across the room, studying every move she made. She looked so convincing, so natural in her role as the loving wife. But Daniel knew better. He could see the cracks in her facade, the subtle ways she distanced herself from him, the quick glances at her phone when she thought no one was watching. At one point during the evening, Sophie excused herself to make a phone call. Daniel knew exactly who she was calling. He waited a few minutes, then followed her outside, staying far enough back that she wouldn't see him. He found her in the garden, her back to him as she whispered into the phone. "I'll be home late again tomorrow." Same excuse. He doesn't suspect a thing. Daniel felt the familiar surge of anger, but he pushed it down, keeping his expression calm. He couldn't let her see him. He listened for a few more moments, catching bits and pieces of her conversation with David. She was planning their next meeting, figuring out how to sneak away without Daniel knowing. Except Daniel knew everything. And soon, she would too. As he quietly slipped back inside, Daniel felt the weight of the moment sink in. The endgame was approaching. He had everything he needed. The financial arrangements were made, the evidence was gathered, and Sophie's deceit had been laid bare. It was almost time. But for now, Daniel would continue the charade, continue playing the loving husband. He still had a few more moves to make before the final confrontation. Sophie thought she was in control, but soon she would realize how wrong she had been. And when the moment came, when Daniel finally confronted her with the truth, there would be no turning back. Everything was in place. The plan was set. And Sophie had no idea that her perfect world was about to come crashing down. The moment Daniel had been waiting for had finally arrived. Everything was in place, the evidence, the financial protections, and most importantly, the timing. He had spent weeks carefully planning every detail, and now he was ready. Tonight would be the night he confronted Sophie, and her carefully constructed world of lies would come crashing down around her. It had taken all his self-control to keep up the facade for so long. Each day, he played the part of the doting husband, pretending he didn't know where she was sneaking off to or who she was really texting late at night. But the time for pretending was over. Daniel was done playing the fool. He had chosen tonight deliberately. It was a Saturday evening, and they had no plans, no friends to visit, no events to attend. Sophie had mentioned going out with her friends again, but Daniel had persuaded her to stay in. He suggested a nice dinner at home, just the two of them. She had agreed, probably thinking it was just another opportunity to keep him off her scent. Little did she know, it was the beginning of the end. Daniel cooked dinner as usual, keeping his tone light and conversation casual. He didn't want to give her any reason to suspect that something was wrong. Sophie seemed relaxed, laughing at his jokes and making small talk as though everything was perfectly fine. But Daniel noticed the way she glanced at her phone every few minutes, waiting for a message from David, no doubt. He couldn't wait to wipe that smug smile off her face. As they sat down to eat, the air between them was thick with tension, at least for Daniel. He felt his pulse quicken as he mentally rehearsed what he was about to say, how he would lay it all out for her. The evidence was sitting in a folder on the kitchen counter, just out of sight. Photos, bank statements, texts, everything. Sophie had no idea that her entire affair was about to be exposed in brutal detail. Halfway through dinner, Daniel decided it was time. He couldn't wait any longer. He put down his fork, looked across the table at Sophie, and took a deep breath. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but cold. Sophie glanced up, her smile faltering slightly. "About what?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a hint of nervousness in her tone. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence hang between them. "I know about you and David." The words landed like a bomb, shattering the illusion of normalcy they had maintained for so long. Sophie froze, her eyes widening in shock. For a brief moment, she said nothing, just staring at him as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. What are you talking about?" she finally stammered, her voice shaky. Daniel's expression didn't change. He didn't even blink. "I've known for weeks. Every lie, every time you told me you were working late, every night you said you were with your friends. I know where you've really been. And I know who you've been with." Sophie's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, to deny everything, but Daniel didn't give her the chance. He stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen counter, and grabbed the folder. He slammed it down on the table in front of her. "Look at it," he said, his voice hard, almost daring her to try to deny it. "Go ahead. Look at the evidence." Sophie hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling as she reached for the folder. She opened it slowly, flipping through the photos and documents. Each one was a piece of the puzzle she thought she had hidden so well: photos of her and David at the hotel, screenshots of their text conversations, bank statements showing the money transfers she had been making to him. It was all there, laid out in black and white. Daniel watched her closely, his eyes never leaving her face. He could see the shock, the disbelief, the panic setting in as she realized just how deep in trouble she was. There was no way out of this. No more lies, no more excuses. "Daniel, she started, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said, his voice sharp. "Don't even try to lie to me. It's over, Sophie. I know everything." She stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. "I was going to tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was going to end it. I didn't know how." Daniel laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You were going to end it? After months of sneaking around behind my back? After draining our accounts to help David with his business? Spare me, Sophie. You were never going to end it. You thought you could keep lying to me, that I'd never find out." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked down at the folder, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. "Please, Daniel," she pleaded. "I made a mistake. I was confused. It didn't mean anything." Daniel shook his head, his jaw clenched. "It didn't mean anything. Don't insult me. You were in a full-blown relationship with him, Sophie. You planned weekends together. You sent him money. You were going to leave me for him." She shook her head frantically. No, I wasn't." "Yes, you were," Daniel interrupted, his voice rising with anger. "You were going to leave me, and you were going to take everything with you. You thought you had me fooled, but you didn't. The room fell into an icy silence. Sophie's tears were flowing freely now, but Daniel didn't care. He had no sympathy left for her. She had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and there was no coming back from that. "I'm done, Sophie," he said finally, his voice cold and emotionless. "You've destroyed this marriage, and now you're going to face the consequences." Sophie looked up at him, her face pale and tear-streaked. What do you mean?" Daniel leaned in, his voice low and full of menace. "I've already taken steps to protect myself. Our accounts, our assets, they're all locked down. You won't be walking away from this with a dime. And as for David, well, let's just say his little business venture is about to crumble." Sophie stared at him in horror, the weight of his words sinking in. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Oh, I can. And I have." For a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. The woman Daniel had once loved was now a stranger, someone who had lied to his face, stolen from him, and planned to leave him for another man. There was nothing left between them but anger and betrayal. "I'll be leaving in the morning," Daniel said, his tone final. "I suggest you pack your things and go to David. See how long he lasts when he realizes you've got nothing to offer him anymore." Sophie didn't respond. She just sat there, broken, as Daniel turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to face the reality of her choices. The confrontation was over, but the fallout was just beginning. After the confrontation, the house was eerily quiet. Daniel had said everything he needed to say and made it clear that there was no going back. The emotional weight of the situation pressed down on him, but it was nothing compared to what Sophie was about to face. Her perfect world, the one she had built on lies and deception, was falling apart. The following morning, Daniel packed his things and left, just as he had promised. He didn't look back as he walked out of the door, leaving Sophie alone in the house that had once been their shared home. For a brief moment, she had hoped that maybe, just maybe, they could fix things. But after everything Daniel had shown her, the photos, the texts, the financial documents, it was clear that there was nothing left to salvage. The reality of her situation hit her hard. With Daniel gone, the house felt empty, cold. She had lost him, and in doing so, she had lost the life she had taken for granted. The man she had deceived was no longer willing to be part of her world, and the safety net she had counted on was gone. The worst part, though, was realizing that she had been completely outmaneuvered. Daniel had been planning his exit for weeks, if not longer, and now she was left with nothing. Sophie's first instinct was to reach out to David, the man she had risked everything for. She needed comfort, reassurance that they could weather this storm together. But when she called him, the conversation didn't go as she had hoped. "David, it's over," she said, her voice shaking. "Daniel knows everything. He's gone, and I need you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. David didn't sound like the man who had been whispering promises into her ear for months. He sounded distant, hesitant. "Sophie, I didn't expect it to come to this," David replied, his tone cold and flat. "I'm in a difficult position right now." "What are you talking about?" Sophie demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "You said we'd be together. You said we'd make this work." David sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "That was before I knew how bad things were on my end. My business is falling apart, and now that Daniel's locked down the accounts, we're in a tough spot. I don't have the resources to support both of us right now." Sophie's heart sank. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. David wasn't going to be her savior. He had his own problems, and she was no longer part of his plans. The promises he had made, the future they had fantasized about, were crumbling just like everything else in her life. "So, what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're just going to abandon me?" David didn't even hesitate. "I have to look out for myself, Sophie. I can't help you right now. And with that, the call ended. Sophie stared at the phone in disbelief. The man she had betrayed her husband for, the man she had sacrificed everything for, was walking away without a second thought. The relationship she had risked everything for had been nothing more than a convenience to David, something that worked for him until it didn't anymore. Her world was falling apart faster than she could comprehend. She had destroyed her marriage, severed ties with the one person who had always been there for her, and now she was completely alone. David had used her, just as she had used Daniel, and now she had nothing to show for it. The next few days passed in a blur. Sophie tried to salvage what was left of her life, but everywhere she turned, she faced the consequences of her actions. The shared accounts she had relied on were empty, her access to funds completely cut off. She called the bank, hoping to find a way around it, but there was no way to access anything without Daniel's approval. He had made sure of that. She even reached out to a few mutual friends, hoping for sympathy, but word had already spread about the affair. People were keeping their distance, not wanting to get involved in the mess she had created. Conversations were short and awkward, and the looks of disappointment and judgment were impossible to ignore. She was no longer part of the social circle she had once been so comfortable in. The financial strain became unbearable. Without access to their accounts, Sophie struggled to pay the bills, and the house, once her sanctuary, felt like a burden she couldn't maintain. Daniel had moved out, but she had no way of keeping up with the mortgage on her own. She tried to reach out to him, to negotiate, but he ignored every call, every text. He was done with her, and there was nothing she could do to change that. Desperate and out of options, Sophie realized that she would have to sell the house. It was the last thing she wanted to do, but there was no other choice. The process was humiliating, showing potential buyers the home that had once been her pride and joy, knowing that she was being forced out because of her own mistakes. Meanwhile, David had completely disappeared. The man who had once been so charming, so attentive, had vanished from her life without a trace. His business was crumbling, just as Daniel had predicted, and he was nowhere to be found. Sophie had gambled everything on him, and she had lost. The final blow came when Sophie received a letter from Daniel's lawyer. The divorce papers. Daniel had wasted no time in severing the last tie between them, ensuring that she would walk away with nothing. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the documents, her hands shaking. It was over. The marriage, the affair, the life she had known, it was all gone. In the span of a few short weeks, Sophie had gone from a woman who thought she had everything under control to someone who had lost everything. The love, the security, the future she had imagined with David, it had all vanished, leaving her alone in the ruins of her choices. As she signed the divorce papers, a cold sense of finality washed over her. This was the life she had built for herself, and now she had to live with the consequences. Sophie thought things couldn't get worse. She had lost Daniel, David had disappeared, and her social circle had all but abandoned her. She was barely managing to hold it together, trying to figure out how to start over from nothing. But just when she thought she had hit rock bottom, the final blow came, and it was far worse than anything she could have anticipated. One morning, a plain brown envelope arrived at her apartment. There was no return address, just her name scrawled across the front. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. She knew instinctively that this wasn't good news, but she wasn't prepared for what was inside. Her hands trembled as she tore open the envelope and pulled out a USB drive along with a brief note. "Now you know who you really are." Confused, she plugged the drive into her laptop. What she saw made her stomach drop. The screen filled with images and videos, photos of her and David together, taken without her knowledge. Some were of them in public places, their faces close as they whispered to each other, their bodies wrapped in the intimacy of stolen moments. Others were far more damning, images of them entering hotel rooms, walking into the cabin they had rented for a weekend getaway, and even screenshots of their private text conversations. The intimacy of it all, documented so meticulously, made her sick to her core. But the worst part came when she clicked on the final video. It was taken from a hidden camera in one of the hotel rooms where she and David had met. The video captured them together, their affair fully exposed in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. There was no hiding from this, no pretending that it had never happened. It was all laid bare, recorded, and now in Daniel's hands. Her vision blurred with tears as she stared at the screen, unable to tear her eyes away from the incriminating footage. This was more than just an invasion of her privacy, it was the final, undeniable proof of her betrayal. Daniel had known everything, from the beginning, and he had collected enough evidence to destroy her. The note on the USB drive wasn't just a taunt, it was a warning. If Daniel wanted to, he could release this information to anyone, her family, their mutual friends, even the media. It would ruin her completely, ensuring that she had no way to rebuild her life, no way to recover her reputation. He had her in a corner, and she knew it. But that wasn't all. Also on the drive were documents, financial records and legal papers that revealed David's true situation. His debts were astronomical, far worse than she had realized. He was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the lawsuits against him were piling up. She could see that Daniel had traced every dollar she had given to David, documenting it all. The picture was clear, David had been using her for her money, and now, with nothing left to give, he had abandoned her. The reality was devastating. The affair that had seemed so passionate, so full of promise, had been nothing more than a desperate move by a man drowning in debt. And she had been too blinded by her own desires to see it. Sophie felt the room closing in around her. The walls seemed to shrink, suffocating her under the weight of her own choices. She had thrown away her marriage, her stability, and her future for a man who had never truly cared for her. And now, she had lost it all. The final blow wasn't just the evidence on the USB drive, it was the realization that she had been outplayed at every turn. Daniel had known about the affair for weeks, if not months. He had watched, gathered evidence, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. And now, with everything in place, he had made sure that Sophie knew she was completely and utterly defeated. For a brief moment, Sophie considered reaching out to Daniel, begging for forgiveness. But she knew it was pointless. He was done with her, and there was no coming back from this. He had locked her out of their accounts, secured his assets, and ensured that she would walk away with nothing. Even if she wanted to, she had no way of fighting back. David, too, was gone. She tried calling him again, hoping that maybe he would at least help her pick up the pieces. But once again, her calls went unanswered. She was truly alone, abandoned by the man she had sacrificed everything for. The next few days passed in a haze. Sophie barely left her apartment, consumed by the weight of her guilt and shame. The thought of the USB drive haunted her, the knowledge that at any moment, Daniel could release the contents and destroy what little was left of her reputation. She had no job, no friends, and nowhere to turn. The life she had known was gone, and all that remained were the ruins of her choices. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the divorce papers she had signed, a knock came at the door. It was a courier with another envelope, this one from Daniel's lawyer. She opened it slowly, dreading what new blow was coming her way. Inside was a simple message. "We're done. Move on." It was Daniel's final message to her. No threats, no more evidence, just closure. He had won, and he had made it clear that there was no need for further communication. The game was over, and Sophie had lost. For the first time since the confrontation, Sophie allowed herself to cry. Real, uncontrollable sobs racked her body as the full weight of her defeat sank in. Everything she had once valued, her marriage, her security, her future, was gone. She had no one to blame but herself, and the realization was unbearable. The final blow wasn't just the USB drive or the financial ruin. It was the crushing knowledge that her life, as she had known it, was over. Daniel had walked away with his dignity intact, while she was left with nothing but regret. As the tears flowed, Sophie realized that this was the cost of her betrayal. She had gambled everything on David, and in the end, she had been left with nothing. The life she had once taken for granted was gone, and all that remained was the wreckage she had created. With the final blow delivered, Daniel felt a sense of closure he hadn't anticipated. For weeks, he had been consumed by anger, betrayal, and the desire for revenge. But now, as he stood on the other side of it all, he realized that what he truly felt wasn't triumph, it was relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, the burden of Sophie's deceit finally removed from his life. In the days following his final message to Sophie, Daniel began the process of moving on. He had already left the house they had shared and was staying in a small apartment across town. It was temporary, a place where he could clear his head and figure out what came next. The house, with all its memories, no longer felt like a home, it was just a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Selling it would be the last piece of his old life he needed to let go. The divorce had been swift and efficient, thanks to the careful planning he had done beforehand. Sophie had signed the papers without a fight, knowing she had no leverage. Daniel had protected his assets, ensured that she walked away with nothing, and severed all ties. Now, legally and emotionally, he was free. For the first time in months, Daniel felt like he could breathe again. He no longer had to keep up appearances, no longer had to carry the weight of knowing that the person he had loved had betrayed him. His life was his own again, and while there was still a sense of sadness about how things had ended, he knew it was for the best. He thought about Sophie from time to time, not out of love or longing, but out of a need to understand how things had gone so wrong. The woman he had once believed to be his partner, his confidant, had turned into someone he no longer recognized. The betrayal had changed him, made him question everything he had once believed about love and trust. But now, as he looked back on it all, he realized that her actions had also taught him something valuable, something about resilience, about strength, and about the importance of knowing your own worth. In the weeks following the divorce, Daniel began to rebuild. He threw himself into his work, using it as a way to focus his energy and push forward. His consulting business, which had taken a back seat during the chaos of his personal life, became his primary focus again. And for the first time in a long time, he found that he actually enjoyed it. The challenges, the strategy, the sense of accomplishment, it all gave him a renewed sense of purpose. But work wasn't enough. Daniel knew he couldn't just bury himself in his career and pretend that everything was fine. He had to confront the emotional aftermath as well. So, he started seeing a therapist, a decision he had resisted at first but soon realized was necessary. Talking about the betrayal, about how deeply it had affected him, helped him process the pain and begin to heal. The sessions were difficult at times, forcing him to confront parts of himself he hadn't fully understood. Why had he stayed so long, even when he had suspected something was wrong? Why had he allowed Sophie to take advantage of his trust? And most importantly, how could he prevent something like this from happening again? The answers weren't easy, but they were necessary. Daniel knew that in order to move forward, he had to understand what had gone wrong, not just with Sophie, but with himself. Slowly but surely, Daniel began to heal. The anger that had once consumed him started to fade, replaced by a sense of acceptance. He didn't need to hold on to the bitterness anymore. He had exacted his revenge, made sure Sophie faced the consequences of her actions, and now it was time to let go. The life they had shared was over, and he had a chance to start fresh. It wasn't long before Daniel began to think about the possibility of dating again. The thought had seemed impossible at first. How could he ever trust someone after what Sophie had done? But as time passed, he realized that he couldn't let one person's betrayal define his future. There were good people out there, people who valued honesty and loyalty, and he wasn't going to close himself off to the possibility of finding someone like that. One evening, Daniel ran into Olivia, a woman he had met a few months back at a work event. They had exchanged pleasantries then, but nothing more. This time, though, there was something different about their interaction. They talked for a while, and Daniel found himself drawn to her easygoing nature, her genuine interest in his life. It felt good to have a conversation that wasn't weighed down by the baggage of his past. They started seeing each other casually, just coffee, a few dinners here and there, but Daniel didn't rush into anything. He was cautious, careful not to let old wounds affect something new. Olivia was kind and understanding, and she never pushed him to open up about his past. But over time, Daniel found himself sharing more with her, about Sophie, about the betrayal, about everything he had been through. It was different with Olivia. There was no pretense, no games. She was straightforward, honest, and she valued the same things Daniel had always believed in: trust, loyalty, and commitment. Slowly, Daniel began to open up to the possibility of something real, something that wasn't tainted by lies and deceit. As the months passed, Daniel found himself in a place he hadn't expected to be, a place of peace. The chaos of the past was behind him, and while the scars of Sophie's betrayal were still there, they no longer defined him. He had survived the storm and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. In the end, Daniel realized that the true victory wasn't in destroying Sophie's world, it was in rebuilding his own. He had faced the worst kind of betrayal and come out on top, not because he had taken revenge, but because he had found the strength to move on. His life was his own again, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough.